Alright guys, welcome back to another one. So we've got some pretty interesting new Stellar Blade information to talk about, as recently director Hyung-Tae sat down with Korean outlet This Is Game to talk about some pretty interesting stuff that hasn't previously been mentioned before. This also revolves around what's going to be happening with Shift Up going forward and Stellar Blade looking towards the future. So let's just dive in. Now, one of the more weaker aspects of Stellar Blade was most certainly its narrative. At least for me personally, though I do see that this is a common opinion amongst reviews towards the game. I think that the world, the setting, and the narrative are just interesting enough, but you don't walk away from this experience thinking, wow, that was insane levels of storytelling. I think in a lot of cases, the story comes across as quite cliche, a form of a story that we've seen previously before if we're looking along the lines of Nier Automata. It didn't necessarily do really anything different, though I think it's a good starting point laying out the foundations of the world of Stellar Blade to provide more opportunity for Shift Up to focus more so on the narrative point of view for Stellar Blade 2. One of the questions that was asked here was, this game has received some criticism regarding its narratives. Are there plans to expand or enhance the main story in the future? And I've got so much respect for Kim's response here. He mentions that I do think the criticism that the story is somewhat lacking is valid. This response more or less explains that the team had initially planned for a greater volume of cutscenes to have further emphasis on the narrative. There's apparently going to be detailed narrative elements like the reason why Eve changes clothes, but due to the high cost and burden of producing cutscenes, they decided to cut back on producing so many of these, which apparently would have supplemented the world building and other character backstories. This was decided to keep overall development efficiency. He mentions that it was this decision that drove them to the point of just barely being able to complete the game. This comes across as Stellar Blade having a development deadline, and whether or not that was set by Shift Up themselves or publisher Sony, where the game absolutely had to be finished by a certain point to release in 2024. He also mentions here that the development workforce and systems for narrative-driven games within Korea haven't really been fully established. There's not a lot of heavy single-player video games that are actually coming out of Korea. This is very much a new thing looking at the East. He goes on to mention that for the Stellar Blade sequel, he's confident that they'll be able to present it with a much richer narrative from the start. I think it's really big of Kim to admit that, yeah, this was one of the weaker aspects of the game. This is nothing but a good thing when we're looking at the future of this franchise. He's aware that there were a lot of criticisms thrown towards the narrative on offer here, and this is something that they can actively seek to improve looking at Stellar Blade 2 and so on and so forth. The next question that was asked here was talking about the big story DLC that was apparently originally planned for Stellar Blade, a big expansion piece of content that would be tacked onto the game to introduce more story. Not only did they ask if this DLC was then transformed into the sequel, but also if they really do intend to get Stellar Blade 2 out by 2027. Now, what's really interesting about this response is Kim had zero idea that Stellar Blade 2 had been announced for 2027. He mentions that that must have been a mistake by the investor relations team. Clearly, there's some kind of a communication issue going on here, but he did confirm that, yeah, it's true, the team are hoping to get Stellar Blade 2 out by 2027. He said that as the team were preparing the DLC, the scope of that DLC grew larger than expected, so he shifted direction and started developing it as a sequel instead. However, a lot has changed since then. This does sometimes happen with video game DLCs, where the amount of content that's going into this additional content just becomes so large, so expansive, that the devs ultimately decide to make it into its own standalone thing or a follow-up. This actually happened with Kingdom Hearts 3's DLC Remind, where originally it was planned to introduce an entirely brand new world to be able to explore. We presume that that world was going to be at least a portion of Quadratum, which has likely then been saved for Kingdom Hearts 4. Kim says that right now the staff have primarily been focusing on the PC version of Stellar Blade, so the sequel hasn't really made significant progress. Right now they're only in the research and development stage of the development pipeline, so this means incredibly early on, but it would be great if we can see a 2027 release. It's not a lot of time. There's only about 3 years right now before we hit 2027, so apparently the team are going to try their best. We're also aware that another portion of Shift Up are currently working on a new game that was originally known as Project Witches, but recently got a name change to Project Spirit. Along with the name change, it also received its very first piece of artwork. And yeah, it's definitely a video game coming from Shift Up. The Shift Up aesthetic is here in full force. We also know that this project is also targeting a 2027 release as well. The next question was asking if Shift Up planned to release anything between now and 2027 to help fill the gap. Apparently there are several things planned right now, and it won't be a period with nothing going on. There's apparently going to be some important developments taking place, and we'll be able to share some of the results with you. I do think at some point, perhaps looking at next year, there might be either a closed or open beta looking at Project Spirits. This is meant to be some type of a live service RPG that will be completely multi-platform, so right now we're thinking along the lines of a Genshin Impact Wuthering Waves. I think we'll also start to see and hear more about that game just in general, beginning in 2026. Now both Kim and the technical director of Stellar Blade were asked about their stance on mods, considering that the game just recently came to PC and already there are a ton of mods developed for the game. This game was curious to know, is this something that the team actively endorse? And they absolutely do. He mentioned, I personally think mods play a positive role in expanding the gameplay experience and scope, so overall I view them positively. Kim mentioned that the modding community isn't quite at full power yet, it's still a bit underwhelming. For now, I'd say the official content is still doing a bit better. This is hilarious because he's basically saying like, well, there are some cool mods out there, I still think that what we've created is a little bit shinier, a little bit better. And asked about what kind of mods he expects to see in the future, he said it is kind of difficult because the team don't provide official modding tools, so it's unlikely that the entire game will be overhauled through mods. But he is looking forward to seeing mods that will slightly change the way the game is enjoyed. Right now, the bulk of Stellar Blade mods are primarily just custom outfits, with a large percentage of these being NSFW. And he was actually asked about his thoughts on adult-related content for Stellar Blade. He mentions that because Stellar Blade is rated for mature audiences, I don't believe we have grounds to restrict such mods, and that pretty much there is no way for any developer to do such a thing. He says here that ultimately it's the user's freedom. Once you own the game, how you enjoy it is up to you. That said, I trust that everyone is a mature member of society and will act within reason. Yeah, he's putting a lot of faith in society. A lot of faith in society. The only real issue that he has here is people paywalling mods, so selling them. This is quite common across large mod communities where there will be a Patreon paywall to gain access to download a certain mod, or just individually selling mods. He believes that everyone should be able to experience community-created content for free. Kim was asked if the team are planning on adding any more additional DLC content into the game. Right now, the team is just focused on doing bug fixes and quality of life improvements, and they feel that because the recent release of Stellar Blade is titled Complete Edition, it implies that it's a compilation of all existing content, and that if new content were to be added after the release of the Complete Edition, it might feel unnecessary or tacked on. Interestingly though, he did say that if players strongly request new content, apparently the team are always listening, so please do share your feedback. I don't think anyone should expect some substantial content to come to Stellar Blade from here on forward. I think the team are just going to want to focus on the sequel, but yeah, maybe if people are like, please add in some sock cosmetics because we want some new socks or something, I don't know, but I think smaller pieces of like cosmetic stuff we might see. Otherwise, I think that's pretty much the additional content run over and done with when looking at Stellar Blade. He did mention though that as for story content, since the main narrative will continue in the sequel, there are no plans to add major new storylines to the base game. However, if players really want it, well, we might not be able to ignore that. So he's leaving this sort of room of possibility, I guess, for some big content to still come to the base game, but I really don't think we're gonna see anything like this. I kind of feel like he was joking when saying this. Maybe at the very least, there could be some additional thing that might come slightly before the release of Stellar Blade 2 to perhaps further connect the two titles, but I think the focus will just be putting all of the resources into Stellar Blade 2. He was also asked if Stellar Blade is going to be making its way to any other platforms. Right now, of course, a lot of people are wanting it on Nintendo Switch 2 and Xbox. He even mentioned here that he does have interest in developing a Mac version, as he spends a lot of time on Mac computers. He said that bringing Stellar Blade to more platforms would have to be discussed with the publisher, Sony. So because Sony PlayStation hold publishing rights for Stellar Blade, ultimately they would have to sign off on if the game can come to any more platforms beyond just PS5 and PC. He believes that we are entering into an era where multi-platform is basically essential, and we're starting to see this a lot within the gaming industry, so he can't say for certain if this will happen for the first game, but he did say that you can definitely look forward to multi-platform releases in our future projects. So maybe the deal for Stellar Blade is that Sony pretty much have to sign off on anything happening with that game, but looking at a Stellar Blade sequel or any of the other Shift Up projects, it will be within Shift Up's full rights to be able to distribute it onto whatever other platforms they want. Here's a bit of an interesting scoop. Kim was asked, in your next title, are you considering adding hidden mechanics or content like in classic RPGs? He said, to turn the question around a bit, Stellar Blade in both the PC and PS5 versions actually have more hidden elements than you might expect. There are still some things players haven't discovered yet. Now, the interviewer followed up by asking, are these outfits or are they other types of items? And he said there's no way they're outfits, they're very minor items, most likely just in-game currency. They have nothing to do with trophies or game progression, but apparently there are some things within the game that apparently still haven't been found. We always appreciate these types of things in games where certain things are found or discovered many years after the release. Whether or not he's absolutely certain for this, because who knows how much time he spends online paying attention to different things that are happening with Stellar Blade, but with this now being public knowledge, it will make players go into a community-wide search to discover exactly what he's talking about. So that's all of the more interesting things that were brought up by Kim within the most recent Stellar Blade interview. From here on forward, I think that things will be relatively quiet for Stellar Blade until we start hearing rumblings about the sequel. Another big development that recently happened for Stellar Blade is that the PC release over on Steam is the most successful PC launch of any PlayStation published game on PC so far. Within the first 3 days of launch, it sold over 1 million copies, and within the first few hours, managed to reach over 100,000 concurrent players over on Steam. That is greater success than any of the other PlayStation titles that have come to PC, like Ghost of Tsushima, Spider-Man, or God of War. Do keep in mind that it's estimated that about 50% of these figures are from Chinese players. The Chinese market is huge, hence why we saw massive success for Black Myth Wukong, as the bulk of that success is actually stemming from mainland China. But these are impressive figures nonetheless. However guys, that's all for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Be sure to slap that like button, it helps me and the channel out a ton. Subscribe to the channel to keep up with everything going on here. A big thank you to my wonderful patrons. I hope you're all having a fantastic day, and we'll talk again real soon.